Most people are plagued by classic nightmares, dreams of falling, failing an exam, or suddenly being paralyzed. But some people dream that something is being done to them. A young woman in the USA is also plagued by nightmares in 1981. Perhaps what torments her night after night for over a year is a so-called precognitive dream, a dream in which something happens that later becomes reality. Cynthia Anderson is repeatedly haunted at night by the idea that something bad will happen to her, and then the young woman disappears forever. Cynthia Anderson may only be 20 years old, but the young woman already has her life firmly under control. She works at a law firm on East Manhattan Boulevard in Toledo, Ohio, where she is employed as a secretary. For Cynthia, it's the perfect job. She can commute to the office in her car, but still live with her parents. This allows her to save some money because Cynthia wants to transfer to college in the fall of 1981. Cynthia has had a boyfriend for some time now, and he has been accepted to the same college. It was important to both of them to go to a Christian college. Cynthia's entire social circle consists of Christian fundamentalists, herself included. Together with her two brothers and her sister, she was raised to be very religious, and her parents seem to be very happy with their daughter. In any case, her father Michael later describes her in an interview as a very quiet, obedient girl. Cynthia's faith is evident in both her upbringing and her education. Her acceptance to a so-called Bible college is a perfect fit. If only it weren't for the nightmares that have recently been plaguing Cynthia. She keeps dreaming that something bad is going to happen to her. She remembers one dream most clearly, in which a man knocks on her door. She recognizes the man in the dream and opens the door for him. But then he does something to her. She keeps dreaming about this man who is pursuing her. No matter where she hides, the man finds her, and he kills her. Cynthia also tells her mother about these dreams. Her mother tries to reassure her daughter, but the nightmares continue for about a year, until they possibly become reality. On August 4th, 1981, Cynthia leaves for work at 8:30 a.m. She skips breakfast that day, much to her father's displeasure. He will later say that Cynthia spent more time on herself and her appearance than on her stomach. Unfortunately, Cynthia's father does not elaborate on this statement. He only says that this may have been part of the problem that would unfold that day. Depending on how you interpret it, this may say more about Cynthia's parents' home than about the 20-year-old herself. Cynthia gets behind the wheel of her white Chevrolet, as she does every day. Cynthia has dressed up for the office as usual. She is wearing a white and red summer dress, open-toed sandals, a brown handbag, her gold watch, and her sapphire ring. In the morning, the first calls from clients come into the law firm. As a secretary, it is actually Cynthia's job to answer these calls. But when clients call on the morning of August 4th, 1981, no one answers. Apparently, the phone is not being answered that morning. But where is Cynthia? Before lawyer James Rabbit enters the office at noon, he first has to unlock the door. This is not unusual, as Cynthia always locks up behind her. However, Cynthia's desk is empty, even though her car is parked outside. Cynthia sometimes leaves the office for a few minutes to get a coffee or a snack, but the young woman is also reliable. When she does this, she always leaves a note saying where she is gone and how long she will be away. But at noon on August 4th, James Rabbit searches in vain for such a note. Cynthia has also not set up a call forwarding service as usual. The radio and lights are on, and the air conditioning is running, but the secretary has vanished into thin air. All James finds of Cynthia in the office is the romance novel she is currently reading. When the law firm is not busy, her bosses don't mind Cynthia passing the time reading, as long as she stays at her desk and is available on the phone. The fact that Cynthia's book is on her desk and her car is parked outside suggests that she did arrive at the office. But when James finds the book, it is open to a page that describes the violent abduction of the protagonist. It is the only violent scene in the entire book, and this page, of all pages, is the last one that was opened. James immediately gets a bad feeling, and rightly so. When the police are called in, they quickly assume it is a crime, and this crime must have been committed with great care. Cynthia was usually alone in the office in the mornings, but there were security measures in place at the law firm. The 20-year-old always locked the door from the inside immediately after arriving. She also had a buzzer on her desk, a kind of alarm button. It was connected to a shop located next to the law firm at the time, so if there was ever any trouble, Cynthia could press the button and alert the neighbors directly. However, this did not happen on the morning of August 4th. Initial interviews confirmed the assumption that Cynthia definitely entered the office. Passers-by saw her at her desk through the windows at around 9:45 a.m. The young woman's workplace is clearly visible from outside through a glass front. The janitor also says he saw Cynthia at around 9:30 a.m. At 10 a.m., the first calls from the law firm's clients came in, but they were not answered. The conclusion is that something must have happened to Cynthia Anderson sometime between 9:45 and 10 a.m. And Cynthia's sister has a dark suspicion. She remembers well the nightmares that plagued her sister throughout the year, dreams in which she was kidnapped and murdered. And the sister is certain that Cynthia subconsciously already knew what would happen to her. The police are faced with quite a mystery. A 20-year-old woman disappeared directly from her workplace, in broad daylight, within a time frame of about 15 minutes, on a busy street. There are no witnesses, no screams, no struggle, nothing. The first clue is graffiti that appeared 10 months earlier on the facade opposite the law firm. Someone spray-painted the words, "I love you, Cindy, GW," there. And Cindy is Cynthia's nickname. In fact, almost everyone calls her Cindy, from her family, to her friends, to her colleagues. The message was sprayed in such a way that Cynthia could see it from her desk. It took a whole 6 months before the graffiti was finally painted over. After a few days, the exact same message reappeared in exactly the same place. The police suspect that Cynthia may have been stalked and kidnapped by a delusional admirer. They are trying to find out who could be behind the initials GW. So everyone with these initials who could have anything to do with Cynthia Anderson is being investigated. The police find only one person who fits the description: the janitor of the law firm at the time. He had keys to all the doors of the firm and could have gained access accordingly. He said he had seen Cynthia at 9:30 a.m. He himself admitted that he was at the firm that morning. However, investigators find no evidence that he spray-painted this message on the building, and apart from the points mentioned, there is nothing else that makes the janitor a suspect. But perhaps there is something to the stalker theory after all. A client of the law firm reports that the 20-year-old had received strange phone calls. He knows this because he had spoken to Cynthia the day before she disappeared and was there when it happened. The client was at the law firm on August 3rd to pay a bill. Cynthia and he quickly took care of the paperwork right at her desk. While they were doing so, the phone rang. Cynthia answered it but hung up immediately, as if something creepy had been said on the other end. Shortly afterwards, the phone rang again. The client later said that he would never forget the look on Cynthia's face at that moment. The young woman was really scared. Nevertheless, she picked up the phone again and quickly hung up. The client asked if everything was okay, but Cynthia waved him off. These calls had been happening more often lately. The client couldn't get this out of his head. On the afternoon of August 3rd, he decided to call the local police. He asked that a patrol check in with the law firm's secretary to see if she was really okay. However, that does not seem to have happened. In any case, the client is certain that someone scared Cynthia to death with those 2 calls. And less than 24 hours later, the young woman had disappeared. Incidentally, the sources do not indicate that Cynthia had told anyone else about these calls. But these are not the only mysterious phone calls in the Cynthia Anderson case. Another puzzling call was received directly by the police department responsible 1 month after Cynthia's disappearance. A woman called anonymously. Her voice did not sound like she was playing a bad joke, but rather nervous and agitated. She spoke very quietly and said she was afraid. She had been told that Cynthia was being held in the basement of a white house. Unfortunately, the caller does not give an address or any other useful information. The police officer who took the call asks her numerous questions in an attempt to find out something. But the young woman just keeps saying she has to hang up now. She only says that it concerns 2 houses next to each other that belong to the same family. Only the son of the family is there and is holding Cynthia captive in the basement. Then, the conversation ends. A little while later, there is another anonymous call, and the same woman's voice answers. She says she is calling again about the Cynthia Anderson case. This time, the police officer reacts quickly and instructs a colleague to join the call. But as soon as that happens, the anonymous caller hangs up again. The police tried to check as many houses as possible, but nothing came of it. To this day, no one knows who the caller was and, accordingly, whether she was telling the truth. According to media reports, at least the graffiti issue has been resolved. The man responsible for it is said to have later reported to the police. The graffiti was apparently intended for another Cindy. But even if you disregard that, there are only 2 options: either a voluntary disappearance or a crime. According to her family and friends, Cynthia herself had no stress, no enemies, and no one who was angry with her in any way and would have had a motive to harm her. My first thought during my research was that if a crime had been committed, it might not have been about Cynthia herself, but about her job at the law firm. And of course, the police came up with this theory too, for good reason. One of the lawyers working at the firm at the time was Richard Neller. Before Cindy's disappearance, Mr. Neller represented a client named Jose Rodriguez Jr. Jose was convicted of drug trafficking and was very disappointed that his lawyer was unable to secure a better deal for him in court. After his release from prison, he cheerfully continued his drug trafficking activities and was arrested and convicted again in 1995. During this new trial against Jose Rodriguez, a new witness came forward. According to this witness, Rodriguez confessed to him that he, Richard Neller, and others had kidnapped and murdered the law firm's secretary, Cynthia Anderson. Jose Rodriguez denies this. You may be wondering what one of Cynthia's superiors would have to gain from murdering her. Richard Neller himself was convicted of conspiracy to traffic drugs in 1996. The lawyer who represented a drug smuggler was actually in cahoots with his own client. According to witnesses, Cynthia Anderson, as a secretary, overheard Richard Neller and Jose Rodriguez talking about a supposed future drug deal. She was murdered so that she couldn't reveal any details. Ultimately, however, the credibility of the witness is questioned in court. Apart from this statement, there is no evidence that Cynthia's boss or Jose Rodriguez are responsible for her disappearance. Neither of them was ever charged with murder or kidnapping the 20-year-old. However, both were sentenced to several years in prison for their joint business dealings. In any case, no body has been found in the Cynthia Anderson case to date. Richard Neller died in 2024 at the age of 80. If he really knew anything about the disappearance of his former secretary, he took it to his grave. And then there is the theory that Cynthia may have disappeared voluntarily. I know this theory is put forward in every missing person case, and people often roll their eyes and think it's totally absurd. I can understand that. But in this particular case, this possibility doesn't seem so far-fetched, perhaps because we have so little information. All that Cynthia's father said in the media was how well-behaved and sensible Cynthia was. He clearly didn't think it was a good thing that she had been paying more attention to her appearance before she disappeared, in whatever form that took. Her entire social circle consisted of hardcore Christian fundamentalists. These are just a few keyholes through which we can glimpse Cynthia's life. But for a 20-year-old woman, such a life can perhaps be very restrictive. In addition, her transition to Christian college was imminent. If Cynthia had secretly dreamed of breaking out of her previous life, the timing of her disappearance might have been her last chance. Cynthia could have faked her own disappearance from her workplace. Her romance novel would fit this scenario most clearly. The fact that the page was open to a section about a kidnapping seems almost like something out of a novel itself. Perhaps that was Cynthia's idea, to lead everyone down the wrong track. The 2 phone calls with tips about Cynthia's disappearance are also striking. Both came from a woman who whispered and gave only vague information. These could also have been attempts to put the police on another trail. Nevertheless, there are also crucial factors that argue against a voluntary disappearance. Cynthia had saved a considerable amount of money in her bank account through her job at the law firm. She could certainly have used this money for a possible new start, but she never withdrew the money. Her social security number also never showed any further activity. However, in 1981, it is also possible that Cynthia simply saved cash and put it aside. And in those days, before surveillance cameras, GPS signals, and precisely documented official procedures, it was certainly easier to go into hiding than it is today. So it could be that Cynthia Anderson is out there somewhere, living a completely different life. Cynthia's mother died of cancer just 2 years after her daughter's disappearance, and her father Michael passed away in 2008. He waited 28 years to find out what happened to his daughter. Unfortunately, his wish was never fulfilled. Nevertheless, Michael Anderson was always sure that she might call or show up at his door someday and tell him what had happened. That's why he never changed his phone number. He also never moved and lived until the end in the house where Cynthia spent her childhood and youth with her family. All in case she ever came home. Unfortunately, that has not happened to this day. Be sure to write me in the comments what you think about this case and which theory you find most likely. In most missing person cases, I find voluntary disappearance really difficult to believe. But in this case, a lot of things fit together, and the fact that Cynthia's boss is involved is somehow not far-fetched. Unlike the missing persons trail, however, this was investigated by the court, and the witness who provided the tip was deemed unreliable. What do you think? I'm curious to hear your ideas. By the way, you're also supporting the channel, because any interaction increases the likelihood that the video will be recommended to people who haven't subscribed to Toledo yet. Other than that, there's not much else to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone, see you next time.